Hey everyone, I am here to talk today about something that's been on my mind for quite a while now, something that I have struggled with for my whole life. And I think that up until now, I wasn't exactly sure how to express it. But in talking to a lot of my friends who are non men around me privately, I know that this is a conversation that a lot of us are very hungry to have, and I just don't see it really happening that often. I'm going to get pretty personal in this one, so strap in. It's going to be a doozy, but we're going to talk today about how we talk about sex and sexuality and sex work. I want to start by saying that sex work is real work. Sex workers deserve all the rights and protections and dignity that all other workers, most workers do not enjoy rights and protections and dignity under capitalism, but all workers deserve that. And I think that any leftist project or any feminist project that does not take seriously the rights and protections and dignity of sex workers who are predominantly femme-presenting people is just not great work. I've been really happy to see the discourse change so much in my lifetime and to see the gains that have been made so far for workers, and also to see the discourse change around sex positivity in general. I think that's all really positive, and this video is not going to be negating or going against any of that. Sam from We're in Hell and also Jordan Teresa made good videos recently on porn and sex work and kind of the capitalist dynamics around them and the potential of sites like OnlyFans to maybe disrupt things and give sex workers more control over their own products. And so their channels are really good. You should go check them out. And I understand that in many ways, these are the more important conversations to be having. So I understand in a sense why I'm not seeing people have the kind of conversation that I am about to have. But I think there's still a really big and important conversation to be had around how different people are socialized to engage with sex, sexuality, porn, and sex work, depending on what gender they are assigned at birth, and the kind of trauma and pain that different socializations can cause. And also a big conversation to be had around why it is that despite our collective moves towards positivity and inclusivity, that the sex industry remains something that is predominantly femme-presenting people doing work for a predominantly male-presenting clientele. I don't have to make a million caveats today, so please understand that I know that predominantly does not mean all, but I'm going to be talking today mostly about the deeply uneven politics, sexual politics in heterosexual relationships and heterosexist society more broadly, and how I think these things are being glossed over in the way that we talk and think about things. I will say that I think that the queer community is doing much, much better, probably because everything is not centered around the objectifying male gaze. And I'm actually, I'm not queer myself, but I'm really enthused and excited for everyone to just queer all of this shit up and just wrest sex and pleasure away from the male gaze. Now, I also don't want to get bogged down in defining the male gaze for everybody, so please go read some feminist theory. You can check out Lindsay Ellis, who talks about it, so please learn more about this. But quickly, it is a theory that came out of film and media studies to talk about the way that, most of the film and the media we consume is presented to us from the perspective of the male gaze, either directly from the gaze of the male characters in the film, or just, for an audience where the gender and sexuality of the audience is presumed to be cishet men. So it affects the way that men and women are portrayed, the way that femme-presenting bodies are portrayed, the way the camera hugs their figures, the way sex scenes are portrayed, etc. And the insights of this can be extrapolated to more, public spaces, because in public spaces, the presumed gender and sexuality of the audience is often, again, the cishet male. So the male gaze isn't just what men find attractive. It is a patriarchal construct that is deeply tied to toxic masculinity and how men are socialized to view women and non-men and sex. It is deeply, deeply objectifying, where women or femme-presenting bodies are made into the objects to be gazed upon. It can be very dehumanizing because women are posited as interchangeable. It doesn't matter who they are as a full human person. What matters is their body, and as long as they're hot and naked, you can kind of swap any woman for another woman, basically. It also constructs this idealized fantasy of feminine sexuality and just feminine appearance in general, right? It's fat phobic, it is ableist. There's often a racial or, there's often colorism that is connected to this, where light skinned bodies are considered often more attractive under the objectifying male gaze. Importantly, there is no real female gaze. Like, if we're just inverting the hierarchy and objectifying an idealized manly man version of a body on screen and using the same kind of techniques and tactics that the male gaze uses, that would be still part of the patriarchal male gaze that also structures how men's bodies should be in a certain way. So it's like the female gaze would not just be an inverse of the hierarchy where we now objectify this idealized version of a man's body up on screen. Just like feminist liberation wouldn't be just an inverse of the hierarchy where you now have women oppressing men, right? So anyway, please look into it. But back to this big question of why it is that the sex industry is predominantly femme-presenting people doing work for predominantly a male-presenting clientele. If your answer to that question is, oh, well, men are just more sexual than women, men just have needs that women just don't have, or some kind of incel logic where it's like, oh, well, women don't need to pay for sex. All they have to do is walk outside. Any cishet man is always DTF, and that's totally normal. DTF with anyone, as long as their body is, appropriating what would be appealing to the male gaze. Now, if your answer is anything along those lines, then you have obviously not thought about this as much as I have thought about this, as somebody who was socialized to believe that my pleasure didn't matter, that I was not a sexual agent. I was the object of the gaze. I was the one that was supposed to do the performing for the pleasure of a presumably cishet male audience. Now, I am old. I don't think people realize how old I am. So I recognize that things have probably changed a lot since I was growing up. Although in talking to my younger non-men comrades, I'm not sure that it has actually changed that much. But growing up, it was very normalized for the men around me to be objectifying femme-presenting bodies for sexual pleasure in a way that it just was not the other way around. And in terms of the ways that I was socialized to engage or not engage with porn or sex work or things like that, I was basically taught in so many ways that it just wasn't really for me, right? Like, men get to go out to the gentlemen's clubs while their good little wives stay at home, right? If women do go out to a strip club, it's probably for a bachelorette and it's like a big joke. There aren't a ton of brothels that cishet women can walk into and pick what man that they would like to pay to sleep with. Like, it just does not exist in the same way at all. And there's this total cliche in film and movies and things like that, right? That teach young minds about their roles in sexual encounters. There's this cliche of, young boys stumbling upon their dad's Playboys or whatever and just being completely amazed and woo, women's bodies. And can you even imagine that happening the other way around, like a coming of age story or whatever, where it's just a group of very young girls stumbling upon their mom's playgirl and being like, ooh, naked men, like it's almost considered like this rite of passage for young men to find this stuff and then, begin their socialization and their education around objectifying femme-presenting bodies for sexual pleasure, right? Again, it doesn't matter who these women are in their full beings, right? It's their bodies. And under like toxic masculinity, once you've seen one, oh, well, that's boring now. We need on to the next, on to the next, on to the next for more and more and more levels of stimulation. And conversely, I mean, I'm not going to say that I wasn't socialized to think that certain features or certain things on a man what were attractive, right? Like I said, the objectifying male gaze, like the patriarchal gaze, also harms men. I know many men in my life who have had eating disorders, who have had just body dysmorphia and, negative relationships to their bodies based on the way that toxic masculinity also presents what a man should be and what a man should look like. But I wasn't socialized to objectify a naked man's body for sexual pleasure or for sexual stimulation. I was socialized to get really turned on by their inner characteristics, right? Like, oh, they're so dreamy. Oh, they're so this, they're so that, right? And that's another cliche that we're shown in predominantly male gaze media, right? It's just like these impossibly sexy women, and I mean sexy in terms of what is sexy to the male gaze, but it's like, these supermodel women falling for these very mediocre guys. Not that they're unattractive or that they don't deserve love, but it's like that's what's presented to us, right? Like falling for these guys that are mediocre or maybe even considered, not manly or not sexy under the patriarchal gaze because they're just really good people inside. And then conversely, right, like men only end up with the nerdy girl or the outcast girl or the girl who isn't, maybe the best looking under the male gaze. They only end up with her when she's gone through this major glow up or this major makeover. And then finally, oh my goodness, look, she's attractive to the male gaze. She is worthy of love. And I think this plays into why I am a demisexual person today. Like I am a very extremely passionately, intensely sexual person. But for me, sex is so incredibly tied up with romance and like really deep, authentic connection as opposed to the physicality, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think it's a great thing, but I also think it has a lot to do with the way that I was socialized versus the way that a lot of the men around me were socialized. And there's a similar cliche around masturbation, right? Like again, it's almost a cliche. I wouldn't say it's a rite of passage, but it's very common to see, a dad or a mom walking in on their son sitting in front of the computer and like, oh shit, he was jerking off, right? That's very much presented to us. And like, could you imagine the other way around? Like, when have you seen anything where a parent is walking in and like their daughter is in there like looking at a magazine and oh shit, she's jerking off? Like, it is just not presented to us in that way at all. Mexi from the future jumping in to say that if we are presented this scene, it's usually in male gaze porn, and it's from the perspective of a man walking in on a woman masturbating is like presented as an invitation for sex or at times even rape. And this all really affects how we understand ourselves and how we understand what is expected of us in our performance of masculinity or femininity when it comes to sex. Like I personally stumbled upon masturbation when I was very young. I was like 8 or 9 years old, and this is kind of an embarrassing story, but I think I'll just tell you anyway. So for me, I stumbled upon it because I would just kind of like get into these frenzies, like thinking about my crush. And again, thinking about like how dreamy they were and how much, how many romantic feelings that I had for them and their inner characteristics. And, I knew what sex was. So I would like think about them and hump a pillow. And then eventually something happened, and I actually had no idea what was happening because that was just never presented and it was never talked about. Like nobody talked about it. And even once I figured it out and I got a bit older, still nobody talked about it. It was not something that you talked about with like your friends or anyone. But I had women friends in college who had never masturbated, who had never had an orgasm, and who just had no idea at all about their bodies, about what was pleasurable to them. Because when you're socialized as a woman in this society, you are given so many messages that just isn't for you. Like it's just not for us. We are the ones that men gaze upon. Our bodies are what men gaze upon when they do that. And we are supposed to perform femininity and perform sexuality in a way that is appealing to the male gaze in order to satisfy the wants and the desires and the fantasies of cishet men. And that gets into your head and you bring that into the bedroom. Like I have had so many experiences in my late teens, in my early 20s, and even now I can still struggle with this. And I know that I'm not alone because I've been talking to a lot of my friends about this recently, but where, I've had so many experiences where I'm actually seeing the experience. Like I'm not really in my body having the experience. I am seeing the experience from the eyes of the male gaze. So I'm gauging whether or not this is good sex or whether I'm performing appropriately based on this vision of what I imagine like the man to be seeing or the man to be taking from the experience. And I ended up having a lot of sex that I either did not want to have fully or sex that I did not fully enjoy physically, but I pretended to enjoy because I had it in my head that, the mark of really good sex was if I could just make the man feel really, really good. Like if I could just make the man just go wild, and if I could be really interesting and sexy and do all these positions, even if it wasn't feeling good anatomically for me, like if I could just perform really well, then that meant that this was a really great sexual experience and I was really sexy, and that I should take a lot of validation from that. And similarly, I've had a lot of experiences with men where, first of all, it's really obvious when a man is like addicted to mainstream male gazy sex, because first of all, they are terrible in bed. They do not listen because they think that they know what makes really good sex. They're like flipping you around every 2 seconds, or just like immediately into these positions which are not physically going to get you off. But it can actually get even more pernicious than that, right? Like you can have these experiences where you think that you're consenting and you think that you're having a consensual, like mutual experience, and then just, they're not there with you. You can feel them just like picturing porn in their head or something, and just like almost like masturbating with your body. And it's incredibly dehumanizing. It makes you feel incredibly small. And that's where it gets also really pernicious when you've been socialized to think that like, oh, well, like my role here is basically to perform for them. So like, oh well. So luckily in my 20s, things got a lot better, mostly because of long-term relationships. And I mean, I did have good sex and like good sexual partners prior to that, but it's honestly an epidemic, which I think I'll get into a bit more. But yeah, like now I'm in my 30s. I am having the best sex I have ever had ever. Like I am having orgasms where I was just not even aware that my body could do such things. Like it's cosmic and like mind blowing. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that I am now a lot more able to fully drop into that experience and be in my body and kind of, reclaim and reverse the gaze, where I'm not totally just seeing it from like the male gaze, and I'm not a performer. I'm like having a mutual experience there. But it took me way too long to get here, guys. Like it took me way too long, and it took me way too many downright traumatizing experiences trying to figure out like my role and my place in a sexual experience, and what was actually pleasurable to me, because very often what is pleasurable for a person with a vagina is not actually depicted in male gaze porn. And having the confidence to assert that. And I think that's why there is such a discrepancy in orgasms and who is having them in heterosexual relationships. We did a podcast about this, so people can check that out. But in heterosexual relationships, women are getting off like 40% of the time. And a lot of men will be like, oh, well, that's just because women just have a hard time getting off. They just can't get off. Meanwhile, like 95 to 99% of women are getting off 100% of the time when they are masturbating alone. And, in lesbian relationships and non-heterosexual relationships, people with vaginas are getting off at least 85% of the time. So... And I think that the male gaziness of mainstream porn plays a big role in this. Like for a long time, I really wondered if there was something wrong with me, because I did not find a lot of what was depicted to be physically pleasurable to me. And again, I was socialized growing up that I should just feign that it was pleasurable. So I did a lot of feigning for a while, I did a lot of feigning until I like had the confidence to be like, you know what, this actually isn't like anatomically pleasurable to me. Like if there is this kind of a sound going on, I don't know what to tell you, but no, no. And again, like as a woman, like it's fine. It's 100% fine to like things for a variety of reasons. You might like that because, you know that your partner likes it and you like just getting into it. You might like pain or you might like whatever. But I think, again, as women, we're taught to adopt things that are pleasurable or that we think are pleasurable for the man that aren't actually like anatomically pleasurable for us. And there are honestly so many dudes. It is an epidemic and a travesty, the amount of dudes who think that like really good sex is just when you like pound it like really hard, really fast. Like, so other examples of the male gaze in porn are that, first of all, the man is silent, right? The man is not speaking, they're not grunting or groaning, right? Because heteronormativity, cishet dudes do not want the man to be really a part of that process. The camera angle is often like from the perspective of the man, or, sometimes you don't even see him, you just see like a dick penetrating, and the whole focus is on the body of the femme presenting person. And the focus is on like how they're reacting to it and how they're enjoying it or not enjoying it. And I can tell when a person with a vagina is not actually getting off and not actually enjoying it. And no shade to the performers, you're doing a great job, and nobody can expect you to be getting off like 10 times in a row, especially with a lot of stuff that they've got you doing. But, it's presented as if that is happening, right? It's presented as if this person is just like screaming and getting off like so many times in a row. And like, no wonder that men have such a warped view of like what sex is. Not all men, hashtag not all men, but so many men have just a really warped idea of like what good sex is, what feels good for a woman, and like what their role should be in the sexual encounter. As well, performers are typically conventionally attractive to the male gaze. They are slim, they are able-bodied, they are young, unless you're watching like a mom fetish or something. They are predominantly white. Many of them have had work done, and again, no shade to the performers, but a lot of times, it's just not a realistic portrayal of what women who don't have access to that kind of work look like naked. And it's stuff that just really comes out of this objectifying male fantasy, but it's a constructed fantasy, right? It's like the idea under capitalism, like, do consumers actually drive demand, or are things just marketed to us that then become the things that we desire and that we demand more of? And because we live in a patriarchal society, this male gaze is everywhere. Like, it's in media, as we talked about, it's in mainstream porn, and it's in public spaces. Like, how many public spaces have I been in where it felt like it was just set up to titillate an audience that I was just presumed to not be a part of? Like, how many times have I been in bars, restaurants, public events, public spaces where, the servers are all femme-presenting people who are very attractive to the male gaze, wearing clothing that is equally attractive to the cishet male gaze, or maybe they are dancers up on stage, or maybe their bodies are being displayed in some kind of way, right? And it's not necessarily bad in itself, but it's incredibly erasing. It reflects back to you that the society you live in doesn't give a shit about your pleasure, doesn't give a shit about your desires, doesn't give a shit about your comfort or your discomfort in being in spaces, with men where things are set up to encourage them to objectify other women's bodies around you. And you're just sitting there trying to figure out, like, where do I fit in this picture? So just like everything else in society, I feel like porn and sex work, like the way that it is presented to us in the mainstream, it's often in this way that, again, presumes that like the neutral starting point, like the neutral point zero of the audience is a cishet man. And like, just the imbalance is everywhere. Like, my partner and I, for example, were streaming Twin Peaks, and I love that show. Amazing show. Twin Peaks is the best. But in the show, first of all, there's a brothel that's like up by the Canadian border where rich married men with kids go to have a time. And again, could you even imagine a story about a small town where, all the men, like all the husbands are at home, putting the kids to bed and whatever, and their wives are out like having a time at a brothel with a bunch of young men? Like, it is so normalized for this to be presented to us in one direction and not the other way around. And I think that's actually really harmful. And on top of that, we're streaming the show, right? So every 2 seconds, every second, there is a nude photo of a woman popping up on screen being like, Anna has sent you 7 photos. And I know, like, I'm sure that those are just viruses that nobody clicks on, but I just have to laugh because I'm like, can you imagine the other way? Could you imagine just a bunch of dick pics popping up on the screen and being like, Maxwell has sent you 7 photos, right? I'm sure if you were on an explicitly gay site, then that would be marketed to you. But in spaces that are considered public, that are considered for everyone, we only get one kind of representation, and it is so normalized. And there are so many other examples of the imbalance, like sex tourism is predominantly men, wealthy men from the global north going to have sex with femme-presenting people from the global south. And I am sure that I'm going to get some strawman, ignorant comments being like, well, heterosexual women are known to do this too. And surely. But I'm talking about the big picture and how this reflects back to us dominant power structures that we really need to challenge and dismantle. Because this imbalance speaks to, honestly, thousands of years, and especially more recently, hundreds of years of patriarchal oppression and a misogynist, heterosexist society. Like, porn in itself is ancient, right? Like, porn and sexual expression and sexual art and things like that have always been present, even back in matrilineal societies and even matriarchal societies. So it's not the idea of it in itself. But Silvia Federici, everyone should read this book, talks about the institutionalization of sex work in the transition from feudalism to capitalism and how it was sanctioned by the elites in a way that was meant to diffuse revolutionary energy. I won't go too far into that, but please just read the book. But, other very violent things were sanctioned by the elites as well. Like, men were allowed to rape low-class women, and that served similarly to diffuse revolutionary energy by dividing men from women and allowing men to kind of climb up a little bit on the hierarchy so that they would be more invested in protecting the hierarchy and not smashing it in solidarity with women and non-men and indigenous and other racialized colonized peoples. But back then, at the time, it was very much something that was emerging out of the fact that, there were not a lot of opportunities for women. Men had all the money and all the power. And so, of course, they could set up the industry in order to cater to their wants and desires. I personally think that this historic imbalance also stems from men not wanting competition for their women, right? Like, women were considered property. They were owned by their fathers or their husbands. And then, if you owned your wife, you also, toxic masculinity and sexuality, you also wanted to be able to have your way, like go pay other people for sex or just have mistresses or whatnot, right? Like, for so long, a man cheating on a woman was not grounds for divorce for the woman, but a woman cheating on a man was grounds for divorce for the man. So there's just this very long history of normalizing this kind of boys will be boys, male sexual entitlement, and, needing to have access to a wide variety of femme-presenting bodies, and women, no, you stay in the home, you be good for your husband. And I do think that in part comes from this, male also insecurity and not wanting to have competition for their women, right? Like, men don't want to be, I think that actually bleeds into today and informs why it is that so many of our public spaces are still set up to cater to the cishet male gaze, because men don't want to be in spaces where there are, objectified visions of, sexy men, sexy man bodies being displayed all around them. First of all, heteronormativity, they don't want to accidentally be into that. But also they don't want to encourage the women around them to be objectifying this idealized version of a male presenting body, because they don't want to deal with how that would make them feel inside. That would be incredibly emasculating. That would, lead them to feel a lot of feelings of jealousy, probably. They would probably start to question their own body and wondering, is my body worthy of being gazed at? Because it doesn't look like all these other bodies that are just constantly on display. They would probably start to develop some really deeply fucked up relationships to their own bodies, and there might be a lot more cases of, eating disorders and body dysmorphia among men. Already there is a lot of that. So under toxic masculinity, where that would be considered to be incredibly emasculating and also gay, right? Men don't want to see other men's bodies. That's just, it's not typical for public spaces to be set up that way, but it's totally fine to just throw women into that situation all the time. And no wonder we all have completely fucked up relationships with our bodies. No wonder people like me had incredibly debilitating eating disorders for years and years and years that led to my chronic illness. But, I'm not bitter. I'm not bitter at all. But, if you're in a situation like that and you're not cool with it, well, that's just because you're uncool, right? Like, you're just not a cool girl if you're uncomfortable, right? Like, you should be down. Like, you should be like, what are you, jealous? What are you, whatever? And it's like, no, I just feel like I'm being fucking suffocated and that my soul is just being crushed from the inside and I want to just like rattle everything around me. But that's not something that typically a lot of men have to think about or go through. Anyway, with the rise of capitalism, it became even more like culturally half the point of becoming a rich, powerful man is so that you can pay to have the best supermodel wife, right? You can pay to be with the women who most perfectly approximate this fantasy of the male gaze. And you can also pay to have other people service you sexually whenever you want, right? And again, like it's not negative in and of itself, but I don't think we can also disentangle a lot of this from male sexual entitlement. And, now we're reaching a point where women do have money. And I think that more people today are choosing to do sex work consensually and sometimes even enthusiastically. I don't want to paint with broad strokes, but I think before it had a lot more to do with financial necessity and not having a lot of options for women. And now as well, we have sites like OnlyFans where sex workers can take greater control of the products of their work. Whereas previously, I do think that a lot of the companies and the studios were run by men and catering to an audience that was presumed to be mostly men. But despite all of this progress, I feel like the culture that we live in and the culture around like sex and sexuality has not changed all that much. Like even with OnlyFans, the way that we talk about OnlyFans, it's like something that only women do. It's like women have OnlyFans. Girls have OnlyFans and guys have podcasts. Like I just saw something like that on Twitter recently. And like, where are all the cishet dudes with their OnlyFans? I'm sure they're out there, but they are most definitely not the majority. And they're not even half. It's not even remotely close to being equal. And if you're going to say to me like, well, supply and demand, baby, like there's just an oversized demand from cishet dudes to see a wide variety of naked femme presenting bodies, then can we talk about why that is and where that is stemming from? Like come on, are we really going to just normalize these vastly unequal patriarchal and often misogynist sexual dynamics in the name of being sex positive? Like Sam in the We're in Hell video said, normalizing porn and sex work is good, actually. And in essence, yes. And, I would love to normalize that. And I would love to move towards a truly sex positive future where the needs and the wants and the desires of all people of all genders and all sexualities are acknowledged and affirmed and celebrated and catered to in ways that are deeply humanizing and not dehumanizing. That would be amazing. But I also I don't want to normalize these unequal patriarchal sexual politics, and I really do not want to normalize the objectifying male gaze at all. And I know that we can do both. Like we can fight for that future while at the same time being a lot more careful to not just gloss over or give a pass to the fucking patriarchy and to all of the issues that we still have here. Like a lot of the way that I hear cis men talking about these things, and I wonder if they are talking this way because they want to be really good allies to sex workers, which I applaud, but a lot of the way that I can see people talking about it, it converge on glorification or exaltation, which I also don't think is positive or helpful given that the conditions under patriarchy and capitalism have not changed. And I wonder, like, do men talk about this stuff among themselves? Like, do they talk about the male gaze? Do they interrogate the ways that they may have internalized it? Do they interrogate their own relationships to sex and sexuality and the products of sex work and how it could be shaped by broader, dominant hierarchical power structures? Like, even my partner, who is the most compassionate, radical, empathetic, thoughtful person that I have ever known, and who is obviously, incredibly gifted at like connecting with me sexually, still shares with me that like he can often struggle with all of this and like the way that he has been socialized under these toxic systems to relate to his own sexuality and to sex in general. So I feel like even if you have interrogated yourself and you think that you have interrogated yourself, like interrogate yourself again. I really want to challenge society to do better, and us on the left to do better in how we talk about this stuff, and do better in raising young people to be deeply in touch with their sexuality, and their pleasure in ways that are healthy and authentic and humanizing. Sometimes it feels like a lot of people want to make this jump to this like fully sex positive place. Like, yes, we're already there and everything goes and isn't this wonderful, without actually doing the massive amounts of cultural, social, internal work that would be needed in order to actually arrive there. And sometimes this blanket like celebration that I'm seeing just feels like it really belies the deep hurt that I have inside me. Like, I still struggle with this stuff. I have done so much work around this, and I know that I'm going to be doing work around this for the rest of my life. Like, I still struggle to feel sexy in my body and to reverse and reclaim the gaze and to realize that it's my gaze that matters. Like, where is my gaze, right? And like, this has been a source of deep pain and deep trauma for me in my life. And so sometimes, the talk of like celebration and positivity, just makes me feel really hurt and unseen and deeply uncomfortable. And I just wish that I heard more conversations like this. Like, I don't see enough people talking about the male gaze in general. Like, there are so many shows and movies and things like that that I just cannot watch because honestly, they are like downright triggering to me. Like, I cannot tolerate it. And if you bring it up, or like if people are like, oh, like, are you watching this show? And I'm like, no, I can't watch that show because it's like incredibly misogynist and like unapologetically male gazy. And they'll be like, oh yeah, I agree, it's not the best like that way, but yeah, I still like it, it's still a great show. And I'm like, no, it's not good if it's misogynist and male gazy to the point of feeling fucking violent. And I want to make clear that none of this is the fault of porn or sex work, like in and of themselves. I hope that that's really clear. The problem is our misogynist culture and how everything that we have in society has grown out of it. But honestly, I think that there would probably be a lot less swerfs in the world if this kind of stuff was talked about and engaged with openly and meaningfully. Like, if there was space for people to talk about their pain and their trauma with respect to their socialization around sex and porn and things like that. Like, I'm sure there's a lot of people who just don't want sex work to happen at all or don't want porn to happen at all. And so, you're not going to obviously reach people like that. But sometimes I wonder if, people just don't really have the language. Like, somebody will say like a blanket statement like, oh, porn or sex work is oppressive to women, it's exploitative to women. And then people will respond like, everyone's exploited under capitalism, and, work is work. If someone is consenting to be there, then it's not more exploitative than other jobs under capitalism. And I feel like that's true, but I wonder if some people just maybe don't quite have the language to be like, no, like in and of itself, it's not inherently oppressive to women, but the culture around it can still feel very unequal and at times oppressive, or at times something that has grown out of this like misogynist, like male entitlement to femme presenting bodies in a way that, it feels like it's replicating dominant power structures that way. And it's because patriarchy and toxic masculinity still structures so much around like how sex and sexual pleasure and liberation is presented to us. For Harriet made an incredible video called WAP and the Spectacle of Sexual Liberation that everyone should definitely check out. But in it, she talks about this, like this idea of reclamation and empowerment when, again, conditions under patriarchy and capitalism have not changed, right? Like we can only get so far without actually dismantling these broader power structures. And I want to say that if you are a cishet man who is very quick to call a woman a swerf or sex negative or any other thing because she expresses pain or trauma around any of this, or if she feels uncomfortable but can't quite put her finger on it, or if she, expresses concerns that I have expressed today, I think that a lot of those conversations, even if you end up disagreeing, I think that you can approach those conversations with a lot more empathy, compassion, deep listening and understanding, because you need to understand that you have likely had a very different experience with all of this. I feel like if a woman or a non-man or whatever is, not being overtly harmful or problematic, then I really don't think it's on you to be policing how they feel about it. Like, you've had a very different experience. So I think that's all I have to say about this. I'm sure I will remember a number of things that I wish I had said later. This has been a very vulnerable conversation for me because it does hit very close to home. And, we talk a lot about how BreadTube is mostly white, but we don't often talk about how BreadTube is also mostly dudes. And I don't mean in terms of content creators. Obviously, there are amazing content creators of all genders, but, my analytics are not great because they are super binary and they do not reflect the wide variety of people of all genders who, consume my content. But my analytics tell me that 87% of my audience are dudes between the ages of 18 and 35. And I am just, frankly, I don't actually know how this conversation is going to land with them. But I hope that for any non-men, any women comrades that I have out there, I hope that if you have had a similar experience or similar pain or upsetness or discomfort, then I hope this has been validating for you. And yeah, I just really wish that I would see a lot more conversations around patriarchy and masculinity and, things like this in general. So in summary, sex work is real work, and we should be fighting for the rights of sex workers and for a sex positive future. But we also need to take care to make sure that we are doing that in ways that remain highly critical of patriarchy and of patriarchal sexual dynamics. We will not truly reach a sex positive place until we, openly and honestly interrogate and break down these structures. And that is going to take a lot of, honesty and deep introspection and vulnerability and just a massive amount of work from each and every one of us. Thank you so much to my patrons. If you would like to support the continuation of this channel and these videos, you can become a monthly patron donor, or you can give me a one-time tip via PayPal. Check out my podcast at veganvanguardpodcast.com. If you like this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in another video.